Well, thank you so much for being here. And what I'm going to do today, if you can put the PowerPoint, please, is bring two reports together, which I think complement each other and is part of the roadmap that we're trying to work. So the first one is the SOFI, that it has been mentioned, the Food Security and Nutrition in the World report. And this report monitors progress towards globally agreed targets, especially SDG 2, and it's a joint cooperation with 5 agencies. It's one of the biggest collaboration agreements that we have. So we have FAO, of course, WFP, IFAD, UNICEF, and WHO working together in this report. And the SOFI has two parts. The first part looks at the indicators, how we are doing, and the second part looks at a topic, and in this year, the topic was urbanization. And then after that, I will move into the SOFA report that was launched last week and bring some of the insights behind that report. But before moving into the report, it's not clicking? Sorry about that. So before moving to the report, let me look at there it is. Yeah, thank you. Let me look at the price evolution, which is what matters a lot in which affects food access and sometimes food availability too. And in this graph, what I illustrate is the evolution of real prices for grains, fertilizers, and energy. It demonstrates how prices have been evolving over time in real terms and highlights some common patterns. If we focus in the last part of the graph, especially from January 20 onwards, we will see that there was a significant increase in prices that started after the COVID-19 and was basically the recovery and the stimulus packages that accelerate that process. And then we have the spike that was exacerbated because of the war in Ukraine. And you see that in the case of the energy prices, they were as high as the previous crisis in 2008. In the case of the food prices in real terms, we didn't reach those levels, luckily, because there was one commodity that was out of this, which was rice, which is what we are observing today, that prices are increasing in rice, but not in that period of time. But we see that there was a significant increase, which creates significant problems to the world. And then we see after some events like the Black Sea Grain Initiative opening that allowed to flow most of the grain from Ukraine, that allows to stabilize the markets, and that's why the prices are falling in the last period of time. So the spike is what created a big exacerbation and some problems in food access and food availability, and not only in the case of cereals, but also in the case of the fertilizers, which were crucial for agricultural production. Now, what is the consequence of all this? This is what I believe is one of the most important graphs of the SOFI. And what shows that at the global level, in 2021, we had 702 to $828 million. Why a million people chronically undernourished? Now, why we talk of two numbers? Because we always have to have uncertainties. We have uncertainties when we estimate those numbers. But we take normally the middle point. In 2022, the middle point of that range was 735 million people chronically undernourished. So you see that we stabilized between 2021 and 2022, but we are far higher from where we were pre-COVID-19. Now, that stabilization has a lot of heterogeneity within. It's basically because of significant improvements in South America, improvements in Asia, in some countries in Asia, but there is a significant deterioration in all regions of sub-Saharan Africa and in the Caribbean, which still are suffering the problem. But why I like this graph so much? Because we projected with our models until 2030 what will happen. And what we see is that we will have, by 2030, if we continue as we are, 600 million people more or less chronically undernourished, which is unacceptable, as it was mentioned before. But also we are able to decompose what was the effect because of the COVID-19 and what was the effect of the war in Ukraine. When we combine both effects, we are talking of a difference in 2030 of 119 million people more chronically undernourished because of those two elements, of the war in Ukraine and the COVID-19, and mostly because of COVID-19. The war in Ukraine by itself is around 23 million people more chronically undernourished. Now, understand that these two events are very uncertain. Nobody were expecting them. There are no risks, there were uncertainties. If those couldn't have happened, then we will have a negative trend again on food insecurity, which for me opens some hope. But we're still seeing that we are having more shocks coming up. But opens some hope because it will tell me that ceteris paribus, we could be turning around the trend, although the velocity will be far from what we have as a target for SDG 2. And that's where, if we are able to turn around the trend for next year, then we need to accelerate enormously to be able to achieve that, and that's the goal on what we are working and what we're trying to achieve. Now, The report this year, as I said, took urbanization, which is one of the major drivers behind food and changes in food consumption patterns, and the major drivers of the changes in food demand and shifts in patterns of food supply. What we do in this report is we look at urban and rural areas as a continuum. We don't look anymore as a discrete. This is urban, this is rural. I don't know if you're aware, but the definition of urban or rural is endogenous to the country. Many countries have very different definitions of what is urban and rural. So the continuum, based on accessibility to local markets and so on, help us enormously to identify what is going on in terms of consumption patterns. The rural continuum in this report is comprised of 10 geographical segments, starting from large cities, where more than 1 million people live, all the way up to rural areas located 2 or more hours from the city or town. And the new empirical evidence that we bring that you can see in this graph is basically working in 11 Western and Eastern and Southern African countries where most of the hunger is happening right now, and where we challenge traditional thinking that rural consumers, or in the extreme more rural consumers, they will consume what they produce. And what we see, and what you can see in the shades of these colors, by the level of process of food, that is not the case. The patterns are similar to the urban, of course in lower magnitudes, but similar, which means that we have to question the traditional notion that in the case of the African rural farmers, largely produce their own food. Own production never becomes the main source of food and represents less than 37% of food consumption. So our policies also for the rural areas, in terms of how we regulate, how we modify the content of foods in terms of super processed foods and so on, will play a significant role also in rural areas, and as we move in the continuum, this will improve. Now, what this tells us is that we have a lot of information behind that will be central to make these policies, and that's where we need to put a lot of focus. To open this black box in which we move in the food world, in the agri-food systems, we call it the FAO, because we don't know a lot of the details. And that's where the SOFA comes into play. Because the SOFA this year is trying to bring together and revealing what is the true cost of food. So we know the agri-food systems, and we call it agri-food systems because it's not only food production, it's also non-food production that we do in the rural areas. So we need to incorporate both, especially if we are going to look at environment and externalities. Because if not, I will be missing a significant part of the component. And we are in a big discussion with all the agencies so that we keep, in the case of FAO, agri means all the different things. It's not only crops, it's livestock, forestry, and so on. So it's very important to have this broader concept of the agri-food systems. Now, but we know that there are very good good things coming from the agri-food systems. That's food, of course, jobs that are very important in the agri-food systems, and of course, culture. Those are the benefits. But we also know that there are costs associated to that. And those are the environment, the society, and the health. And those costs normally are not quantified, are not measured. And that's why they are called the hidden cost behind the production of agri-food systems. And that's where we need to keep working. In most cases, these costs are caused because of market, institutional, and policy failures, which make that resources are not allocated properly in the proper incentives. For sure, you have heard about the agenda of repurposing that we are working with the World Bank and others of agricultural support. And what you find is that a lot of the investment or support to agriculture is not oriented towards minimizing those externalities. And why this is so relevant? Because as FAO, we don't only want good food for today, but we want good food for tomorrow. And if we don't take care of these externalities, we won't be able to have the good food for tomorrow. And that's what we are trying to attract climate investment to this sector, because it's so important for the good food for tomorrow. So what do we do here? So we try to measure all the different hidden costs behind the value chains. And we go from primary production to consumers. And the model used in the analysis was paired with the FAO stat. That's another big effort that FAO is doing, that everything we do, we put the data public. And FAO stat is bringing data on greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen emissions, land use, blue water, and other types of indicators, and we collect data from our partners too. What we can see in this figure is that we incorporate the environmental hidden costs, which are the shaded in green. We also bring the poverty and undernourishment costs, which are the social hidden costs in orange. And we also bring the burden of disease from dietary patterns, which is the health-related hidden costs, which are in blue. And unlike previous estimates, one important property of the analysis done for our report is that these were estimated for national agri-food systems for 154 countries. So this year we're able to come with a global number. Next year we're going to go country by country. So it's a 2-year SOFA for the first time in the history of FAO and in the history of SOFA. But we need to understand that because these are monetized, we will be able to disaggregate, create different aggregations, and compare regions and countries, and that's very important. But we also need to acknowledge that there are some hidden costs that we are not yet able to measure because we don't have the data, and that's where we need to put a lot of new effort to improve the data. And that's why we argue that our indicators are preliminary. And we need to keep working on that, and that's the ideal work of having a second-year SOFA that will allow us to do that. So what are the numbers? Oh, sorry. I think I jumped. Okay, this one. What are the numbers that we got? So we find that the agri-food systems generated 12.7 trillion 2020 PPP dollars in hidden costs in 2020. 12.7 trillion. Now that number has certain level of uncertainty, and the most secure number, which we have a 95% chance, is $10 trillion, 10.7 trillion, $10.8 trillion 2020 PPP. Now, the 12.7 trillion is equivalent to about 10% of the global GDP. It's equivalent to per day, that these costs are equivalent to 35 billion in 2020 PPP dollars, or about 4.5 PPP dollars per person every day. We found with very high degree of confidence that the $10.8 trillion of the hidden costs are 95% certainty, as I mentioned before. Now, when we break this down by subcategory, environmental hidden costs amount for $2.9 trillion in 2020 PPP dollars, and this corresponds to about 20% of the total quantified hidden costs caused by agri-food systems. And these are likely to be underestimated because of some missing hidden costs that we were not able to measure. More than half of these costs are pertaining to nitrogen emissions, mostly from runoff of surface waters and ammonia emissions to air, and they were followed by contributions of greenhouse gas emissions to climate change, 30%, land use change costs, 14%, and water use of 4%. The second ones are the social hidden costs, and these are amount to $571 billion of 2020 PPP. And these are mostly due to poverty and much smaller part to undernourishment. And the third, which are extremely important, are the health hidden costs, which account for the majority of the hidden costs, being more than 9 trillion 2020 PPP dollars, or 73%, and the large majority of the hidden costs are based on losses in productivity from unhealthy dietary patterns. So the quality of the diets matters substantially in these hidden costs, and that's something extremely important, especially when we look at the distribution. So in the left figure, you see the breakdown of the total quantified hidden costs by main category and country income group. The hidden costs differ not only in the magnitude, but also in the composition. The first observation is that most of the hidden costs are generated in upper middle income and high income countries. The second is that lower middle income countries account for 22%, while the low income countries make up the 3%. In all country groups, apart from the low income nations, productivity losses from dietary patterns are the most significant contributor to the agri-food system damages, followed by environmental costs. And this must give the impression that hidden costs are a problem only in high-income countries, but that's not the case, because when we look as a proportion of the GDP, the picture changed completely, which is the picture that you have in the right-hand side. And this figure on the right-hand side looks now at the share of quantified hidden costs to GDP with hidden costs per capita on the right-hand side. Comparing the cost to GDP gives a sense of the burden that these hidden costs place on national economies and provides an indication as to where the prioritized resources should be to address these costs. As a share of GDP, costs are relatively much higher in low-middle income countries, at an average of 27%, even through high-income countries generate the highest per-person cost, which is the number that you have in the bars in the right-hand side. So in the high-income countries, the average per person is $3,800. And the ratio of hidden costs to GDP is 12% and 11% GDP in lower and upper middle income countries respectively. So clearly it's a challenge also for the poorest countries because it's a bigger share of what they produce and their GDP they have. Even if we look within countries and we compare countries, and in this figure we show that the composition of costs in relative terms for a subset of countries, low middle income countries, the case of Egypt and Iran, upper middle income countries, the case of Thailand, and high-income countries, the case of Canada and the USA, for which hidden costs represent 8% of the GDP, so the relative scale is minor. As we can see, both the US and Egypt, the two extreme in terms of income on this graph, dietary costs represent 87% of the total hidden cost. Canada and the US show also a different profile with much higher environmental costs. For a country like Iran, the nitrogen leakage and fertilizer-related pollution represent 35% of the hidden cost. So that's why this is so important. That's why in the second year we're going to work with the countries, because we want to fine-tune this information. And please understand that this does not mean that these hidden costs will be valued in the market and will increase prices. That will be the wrong perception of this report. The idea here is to open this black box that we had in terms of hidden costs so that we can use mechanisms and policies to create the proper incentives to minimize those, so that we can have good food for today and for tomorrow. That's the whole concept. Of course, in some cases, the super processed foods, if policies are put in place, prices could rise in those commodities. But that could imply also that healthy diets could decrease prices and we can improve access. The SOFI of this year showed that 3.1 billion people don't have access to healthy diets. So this will create a significant impact in improving and balancing the distribution of food. So we have enough cereals in the world. The problem is of distribution. We don't necessarily have enough high-value commodities in the world to be able to achieve a low-cost healthy diet so that we can reduce these 3.1 billion people. But again, there is a huge distributional problem. So we need to resolve those problems at the same time, but we need to understand all these hidden costs. So let me briefly finalize, trying to bring all together all the different SOFIs that we have been working on and SOFAs. And here the idea is to look at the sequences and the importance of the topics and how relevant they are. The first one is to integrate humanitarian development and peace-building policies. That's something that we are working today. That's the nexus that we are working. We need to protect the households and value chain during economic slowdowns. That's the consequence of what we saw in the case of COVID-19. We need to scale up climate resilience across the agri-food systems. We need to address specific challenges associated to water management. Water is central, and one of our SOFAs was on water. We need to focus on value chains contributing to healthy diets. That's also essential. We also had a SOFA that came out in terms of resilience just before COVID-19, surprisingly, and which was central to look at what happened in the war in Ukraine. We need to look at the financing. We need to realign the public expenditures to assure access to healthy diets in a sustainable system, and we need to look at the different mechanisms of financing. The next SOFI for next year will be on financing. So instead of urbanization, we're going to look at financing for the next SOFI. That will be the topic. And finally, what I am presenting today is better policies and investments in more sustainable agri-food systems that can reduce hidden costs without increasing families' expenditures on food. So that's the roadmap that we are moving. We are going to COP now, COP28. FAO is presenting the roadmap to SDG 2 and 1.5 degrees, exactly with this concept in mind, with this motto of better food for today and for tomorrow. And then we move into the G20 of Brazil and the COP30, where we finish the work in terms of this roadmap. Thank you so much.